Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Craig Burton. I'm joined with Rob Taylor. I'll be handing over to Rob shortly to do the meat of it. First of all, I just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping with you. So you should see on your screen a control panel, something similar to this. And there's just a few things worth pointing out. There's an orange arrow, which I'm now pointing at with a black arrow there. That will minimise that control panel so you can see more of the screen. You'll see that your microphone is muted. That's so that we can manage the webinar correctly. With 60 odd people on the line, it becomes quite chaotic if everybody's speaking. We're not going to be using the webcam, which is the next bit down. There's a little hand signal there. Just to check that people are hearing me correctly, could I please ask you to just press that hand button and that'll flag to me that you've put your hand up. Yeah, one person at least is listening, so that's good. Oh yeah, brilliant. Hands going up all over the place, so that's good. If you want to ask questions during the webinar, please use the question section. We'll try our best to answer them during the webinar, but if we're unable to, we'll attempt to answer them afterwards if they're a little bit too more detailed. And right at the very bottom, we've uploaded a copy of the IPv code if you haven't already downloaded it, and also a copy of Categorized Waters M-Notice, which you can download and read at your leisure. Okay, I will now hand over to Rob. And let him get on with it.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. To start with, we're going to look at some of the key definitions that support and back up the intended pleasure vessel code. So if we start with, firstly, what is an intended pleasure vessel? Well, for part 2 of the code of practice, an intended pleasure vessel is simply any vessel which is intended to be used or is normally in use as a pleasure vessel, and pleasure vessel is also defined, but which is used at sea as a race support boat. Okay, so hold that in the back of your mind whilst we go through this. What is at sea? At sea, from an MCA perspective, is beyond the UK categorised waters. The extent of categorised waters varies around the UK coastline, depending on local geography, relative amounts of shelter available, and such like. So this, whether you operate at sea, may or may not affect some of or all of you. And what is a race support boat? A race support boat is that which is used for race support activities, which again is defined, we'll come on to in a sec, for racing affiliated to a national governing body of sport. So for racing under the RYA, but equally for other sports as well, such as canoeing, paddling, kayaking, that sort of thing as well. So the relevant national governing body for the sport that you're taking part in. So race support activities can be mark laying, safety cover, providing support for competitors at sea, adjudicating a race, so for race officials, for umpires, judges, measurers, marshalling to and from an event, or as far as going out checking tide, weather forecasting, coaching, that sort of thing, or any other similar activity which is in direct support of the event, for racing that happens at sea. A racing event has been defined as a series of races to be held over no more than 7 consecutive days. This is something that we've negotiated and kind of worked with the MCA on quite a lot on behalf of our members to actually make sure that a series of races is fit for purpose. And this is where we've got to with that. What is a pleasure vessel? A pleasure vessel is the kind of key part to what is IPV code. And it's broken down into a number of sections. So it's split up into vessels owned by individuals, vessels owned by body corporate, and vessels owned on behalf of members club. So if we look at the case of an individual first, a vessel owned wholly by an individual or individuals for the use of sport or pleasure of the owner or immediate family or friends. And that is what is deemed to be a pleasure vessel in that case. If we move on to the, I'm going to skip over body corporate as it's probably less relevant to our audience today, and go straight to members clubs. So a vessel owned by a members club, again, for the sport or pleasure, and at the time it's being used for the sport or pleasure of the members of that club or their immediate family. Okay. Yeah, we'll run a quick poll. So on the basis of the definitions that we've covered so far, there's a quick straw poll. How many people now believe that the IPV code will apply to you or your club? Okay, give you a few more minutes just to click your buttons. Yeah. Okay, so majority of people still think that the IPV code is the one for them, which is good. So we can crack on and explain a little bit more about the applicability of and how the code will affect you. So the applicability of the code, the intent is not to be overburdening. The intent is to provide proportionate and appropriate level of safety cover. Safety for vessels which are in use as a race support boat. It's not intended to be any more onerous than would normally be expected for vessels going to sea. You know, the usual race management practice for race sport boats that you would have, this isn't intended to go over and above what is normally required. The IPV code is applicable to vessels which are up to 15 meters in length, which are operating as a race support boat and at sea, and which ordinarily fall outside the definition of pleasure vessel, and which are already not certificated under an alternative code of practice, and for up to 10 racing events a year. So if we have another quick straw poll, now that we've seen what it applies to and who it applies to, can we run that question again, Craig, and then see how many people now still think that it applies to them? Yeah, closer to that. Okay, so a number of people now that think the IPV code applies to them is now reduced, actually, which is encouraging. So moving on, if we look at the impact on clubs, as I said previously, it's not intended to be any more onerous than you would normally expect. The impact that the RYA see on clubs is relatively minimal. It's relatively minimal. What the introduction of this code does is actually move the UK law around what currently goes on at clubs in terms of their use of race support vessels. So the use of ribs and of yachts for committee boats and mark laying and pin ends and safety cover has existed for a long time, and that falls into a sort of grey area between what is actually deemed to be pleasure vessels and what may be deemed to be a commercial operation. So what this does is clarify the use and when a vessel is then deemed to be in commercial activity. And like I say, moves the law around what current practice is. There is a limitation, the limitation of up to 15 metres. It may impact on a small number of individuals or clubs who operate at sea in vessels larger than 15 metres and which do not comply with the definition of pleasure vessel, or for which loan boats for a series of races over weekends rather than consecutive days. And as you can see from the bottom point, there is a limitation of 10 racing events per year, which may impact on a small number of clubs that operate at sea as race sport boats. The size limitation, we've worked pretty hard on your behalf. Initially, when it was sent out for consultation, it was listed at 8 metres. We managed to get that up to 8 to 15 metres to take into account the use of yachts as committee vessels. It was initially set at 8 metres as the MCA thought that trying to fit all equipment required for normal codes of practice onto a small boat was impractical. The same argument isn't true for vessels, for larger yachts, which, if operating at sea and outside of the pleasure vessel definition, would be deemed to be a commercial operation. And so the argument that you haven't got space to fit all the required equipment on board falls down, and so you should comply with the code at that point. That was their argument. And like I said, we managed to negotiate with them and make sure that actually 15 metres covers the broad base of yachts that are likely to be used as committee boats. The intended pleasure vessel code is for temporary use only. If individuals are exceeding the limitation of 10 racing events per year, or in effect 70 days at sea, the argument that that vessel is being used more commercially than as a pleasure vessel, and so it should tend to comply with the codes of practice. The IPV code requires a safety management system to be put in place to manage and mitigate the risks involved of sending vessels to sea. Now, the definition of safety management system in the definitions section of the IPV code looks quite intimidating and overbearing. However, in practice, safety policies that are in place at your club or put in place by event organisers are likely to cover what is required. You may find that you've got multiple documents that you have for covering an event, and you may need to add an additional kind of catch-all document that pulls the relevant parts together. For example, safe operation of ribs, processes on board a committee vessel, your policies for safety cover for fleet racing, for example. And equally, parts of the notes of race or sailing instructions may also have safety elements involved, which kind of pulling all of those areas together will form your safety management system. There are specific areas that you need to include within this, so it limits on the areas of operation and limiting conditions in terms of weather conditions, sea state, that should be observed by each race sport boat. So details on where to find weather forecasts, the type of information you need. It's probably all in place. It's probably just not what you would normally call within your club environment as your safety management system document. Okay, so the crux of it, what are the requirements? What do you need to do in order to comply with Part 2? The conditions for compliance are laid out in Section 6 of the IPV code. We'll go through some of the more general points. Radio and navigation equipment. So radio communications require a minimum of 1 fixed or portable VHF, and they give a whole list of guidance on different types of radio communications, so it's worth having a read of all that. From navigation point of view, 1 compass, be it electronic or analog, and suitable charts of the area of operation. Now that can be paper charts, it can be electronic charts, it could even be the map, the course card supplied with the sailing instructions that detail the area of operation that you're likely to be sending your race support boat into. Bilge pumps, there, as well as an option of manual or electronic bilge pumps, the minimum requirement that you would need is 1 baler or bucket. From a fire safety point of view, it's a minimum of 1 multi-purpose fire extinguisher, and the size and specification for that is listed in the IPV code. But generally, it's the sort of equipment that you would normally carry on board so far. From a life-saving point of view, throw and tow lines will be required, flares, a foghorn, a first aid kit, thermal protective aids, and PFDs to be worn at all times by those on board. From a construction and machinery point of view, emergency steering provisions should be considered. This can be as basic as an additional steering oar for ribs, and that would be considered okay. Provision of spare fuel, kill cords that should be are required to be worn by the skipper when underway. From a manning point of view, manning and qualifications point of view, the minimum requirement would be for RYA Powerboat Level 2. However, there will be no commercial endorsement of that qualification required. This is again a change from what was initially sent out. This is something that we've worked on through the consultation process with the MCA. In addition to that, it's advisable that at least one person on board has a suitable VHF qualification, and again, first aid at sea qualification. So the RYA first aid course would suffice in that case. And self-declaration. There is a self-declaration form certificate at the back of the code, which is required to be signed by the owner and the operator, and a copy of that needs to be kept on board. So on board each vessel. So for a rib, for example, if you're concerned that it's a piece of paper that's going to get wet, then either laminate or store in a dry bag. For example, just make sure it keeps dry. But these need to be kept on board at all times. And you need to do one of these self-declaration form for each race event that you attend. In terms of implementation, we've now had the final draft from the MCA last night or this morning. It's their expectation this will be published by the end of day on the 17th of December. So is that next Monday? So have a look for it on the gov.uk website, certainly by the 18th of December. And this will be effective on the 1st of January 2019. And that kind of wraps up a very brief summary of the aims and requirements of the IPV code. I would strongly recommend, if you think it applies to you, then the code and the way it's been formatted and structured has been amended a lot since the initial draft of it was sent out for consultation. It is now much more readable format, and especially the requirements for Part 2. So if you have so one of the questions come in regarding kill cords on yachts. The kill cord requirement is there only for open boats, so you don't require a kill cord if you're driving your yacht. Okay, that pretty much wraps up our webinar for this morning. If anyone has any questions, then feel free to type away and we can answer them in the next few minutes. If not, then send us emails to the email addresses on the screen. Okay, one more question coming in. Is there any limitation on remuneration, i.e. if a member lends a boat? The definition of pleasure vessel, if we can skip back to that, covers remuneration effectively. Too far. So, in the case of an individual, owned by an individual for use of sport pleasure of the immediate family or friends, and on a voyage or excursion for which the owner does not receive funds. Okay, except for the normal expenses for the operation of the vessel. So if you're lending your rib and the club that you're lending it to puts the fuel in it, that will be considered to be normal ongoing expenses incurred with the operation of the vehicle, the vessel. But if you then charged a fee on top of that, then that wouldn't be the free voyage or excursion. So at that point, you would be a commercial operation. Yes, can we get a copy of the slides distributed yet? This webinar is being recorded and will be available to play back, and we can send the slides out to those that have signed up. Why is VHF license required? Safety channels exempt. It's the safety channels that aren't exempt. It's the distress channels that are. In the draft, there was a limitation course size of 1 nautical mile. Is that still applicable? No, that has been removed. If a race area is on the edge of categorized waters and the club-owned committee boat regularly that goes beyond, if it is a club-owned boat owned and operated by members of the club, then it falls into the category of a pleasure vessel, and so that will be okay. One of the also things to bear in mind is that if your kind of nominated departure point or your club is within categorized waters, because of the definition of nominated departure point, your limitation of 3 miles to sea actually then transposes out to the extent of categorized waters, so you then get 3 miles from the extent of categorized waters. So if you're operating right on the cusp of in categorized waters, outside of categorized waters, then you'd be okay under this. Is there any further questions? If we loan our RIB to the class association for additional training, consequently go over 10 race events, then a commercial vessel, and they're not required to comply with the IPV code. It depends on how that vessel is going to be used at the time and who is manning it effectively. It may, in that sort of instance, if it's manned by a club member and club members are part of that class association, then it could fall under the definition of pleasure vessel for a members club boat. And in the case of an individual, it could also extend to the owner's immediate family or friends. So if you have family or friends who are involved in the class association and out on the water doing the training course, then for use for your sport or pleasure, or the immediate family or friends could mean that the RIB in that case is a pleasure vessel. Okay, were any more questions? Right, if we loan a boat to a race training sport club and coach, who is the owner? Okay, if we coach who is also the owner. Race training sport club and the coach. Okay, so if the coach, thanks for your question, Nick. If the coach is also the owner of the RIB and the coach is on board at the time of doing the race training, then that will still be deemed to be a pleasure vessel as the owner of the vessel is on board. the reimbursement aspect of it, I'll may then take you outside of the definition of pleasure vessel. So I'll contact you offline to go through your specific case directly with you. I think we're pretty much there. The last one, if we collect a fee for the use of the RIB, i.e. 30 days to cover mechanical expenses, does this trigger commercial use? Yes, it will do. If the direct expenses in the for the operation of the vessel is one thing you would have to be aware of. It's not mechanical cover like that isn't a direct expense. It would be for fuel and the like. We had a question from Chris. If you define yourself as a pleasure vessel, how is this likely to be challenged? It's not for you to define yourself as what you think you are. It's be how the vessel is being used at the time. So if you as an individual, you can prove it's for your sport or pleasure, or for the sport or pleasure of you or your immediate family or friends, then you would fall into the category of as a pleasure vessel, but that wouldn't necessarily be for you to determine. And how is this enforced? Well, it will be, the MCA have said they will be, it would come under report of effectively breach of this code to them, and then they would send enforcement officers to investigate. Okay. With training, we are over 10 events per year. Is there a way around this? Again, it depends on what the vessel is, who it's being used by, and whether or not it falls outside of the definition of pleasure vessel. There's an awful lot that hangs on what that definition is. It depends on who's doing the training, who owns the boats used, and under what sort of circumstances. We have tried to extend the 10 racing events more than it is currently, and the MCA have drawn the line at this point. They're not going to make that any more. It comes down to their safety, safety risks involved of vessels operating at sea. So if you're in kind of doubt, then either email us directly and we can go through on a case-by-case basis. Or if you're if you're having to ask the question as to should I get coded, should I not get coded, then chances are, if you're asking that question and you're in any doubt that you might fall into a commercial operation, then it's best ask the question and then seek your own independent legal advice or contact the RA for further help on that. Lots of questions now, I can hardly keep up with them. Difficult process to register a RIB as a commercial vessel. So a question, is it difficult process to register a RIB as a commercial vessel? No. You can drop us a line on the email address at the end of the presentation and we can help work through the coding process with you on that one. Will the RWA provide a template for the self-declaration form? The template form is actually at the back. It's on the back page of the IPV code, which was is distributed through this webinar as a handout. It's also available on the gov.uk website from 18th of December. It's the back page of that. It's a very simple form. It outlines what a lot of the requirements that we outlined in this webinar, and you sign, or make sure the owner and the operator both sign to declare that the vessel is in compliance with that code. So that's pretty straightforward. Okay, so the last question that we've got is, who do we email for questions? And if I flick forward back to the end of the webinar, feel free to send emails to either technical@rwa.org.uk or scvcert@rwa.org.uk, and either myself or Craig will be happy to help further. Okay, thank you very much for your time. I hope you found this helpful and useful, and if anyone does have any further questions, then feel free to drop us a line. Thank you.